I remember the exact moment the room fell silent. My fiancé's father, Richard Calloway, a retired cardiothoracic surgeon with 35 years of operating room authority etched into every word he spoke, was midway through telling me how modern medicine had lost its standards. He had one hand resting on the stem of his wine glass, his dinner plate pushed slightly to the side the way people do when a conversation matters more than the food, and he was speaking carefully, the way someone does when they believe they are the only adult at the table. "The problem with these new residents," he said, "is that nobody teaches them how to think anymore. They come out of medical school knowing how to read a protocol. They don't know how to make a decision." The dining room went quiet. My fiancé, James, shifted almost imperceptibly beside me. His mother, Patricia, reached for her water glass. Richard took a slow sip of wine, comfortable in the silence he had created, and I set down my fork, folded my hands in my lap, looked across the table at him and said, very calmly, "You're right that decision-making is everything. It's something I think about every day, actually. I'm the new chief of cardiac surgery at Whitmore Medical." Nobody moved. Not James, not Patricia, not even the candle flame on the center of the table seemed to flicker. Richard Calloway looked at me the way a man looks when he believes he has simply misheard something. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, how a quiet Saturday dinner in a Connecticut suburb became the most disorienting evening of Richard Calloway's professional life, you have to start a little earlier. About 3 weeks earlier, to be exact, I had just accepted the position at Whitmore Medical Center in Hartford. I was 34 years old, and I had spent the last 12 years moving through residency, fellowship, and early attending roles with the kind of focus that doesn't leave much room for anything else. Cardiac surgery is not a field that rewards divided attention. The hours are long, the cases are unforgiving, and the learning never stops. I had trained under 2 of the best in the country. I had published. I had operated in hospitals in 3 different states. And when Whitmore offered me the chief position, it felt less like an arrival and more like the next set of responsibilities beginning. What I hadn't anticipated was that accepting the role would land me in the middle of a family situation I didn't entirely know how to navigate. Because 4 months before that offer letter arrived, James Callaway had asked me to marry him. James was not a physician. He was an architect, quiet and precise. Someone who thought in structures and light and the way space makes people feel. We had met 2 years earlier at a fundraiser for a pediatric hospital in Boston where I was still completing a fellowship. He had designed one of the new wings. We talked for an hour near a window overlooking the city, and somewhere in that conversation, I stopped thinking about the cases waiting for me the next morning. James knew exactly what I did. He knew my hours, my world, the particular exhaustion that follows a long surgery. He never made me apologize for any of it. Outside the hospital, I was just myself, and he seemed to prefer it that way. One evening, about a week after I arrived in Hartford and started learning the rhythms of my new department, James came over to my apartment with takeout containers and that particular look he gets when something is sitting in the back of his mind. We ate at the kitchen counter, rain tapping against the windows. Halfway through dinner, he said, "My parents want to have us over." I smiled. "That sounds good." He nodded, but something in his posture didn't quite relax. "There's just one thing." I set down my chopsticks. "My dad?" he started, then paused. "He's proud of his career. 35 years in cardiac surgery, a lot of it at a time when the field was very different." "I understand that kind of pride," I said. "I know you do." James looked at his food for a moment. He also has opinions. Strong ones. About how medicine is practiced now, about younger physicians, about the direction hospitals are heading. "That's not unusual for someone his generation," I said. "Right." He hesitated. "He also doesn't know what you do." I looked at him. "What does he think I do?" James gave a small, pained smile. "I might have told him you work in hospital administration." I stared at him. "I was going to clarify," he said quickly, but then one conversation led to another and he had already formed this whole picture of you, and I thought if I corrected it, the first time you met him would become about your credentials instead of about you. "James, I know. You told your father I work in hospital administration." More or less. He winced. Okay, exactly that. I sat with that for a moment. In medicine, I had spent years being introduced by my title first. Sometimes that was useful. Sometimes it turned every conversation into a performance. Meeting someone's father as simply the woman James loved, without the title preceding me like a herald, was actually something I could understand wanting. Still, how long has he believed this? James looked genuinely sheepish. About 8 months. 8 months. The longer it went, the harder it was to bring up. I almost laughed, and now he's invited us to dinner. Saturday, James confirmed. I thought it over. I thought about what it might feel like to sit at a table with a retired cardiac surgeon who had no idea I ran the department he once would have applied to lead. I thought about how that evening might unfold. All right, I said finally. James blinked. All right, I'll come to dinner. You're sure, James? I said. I've delivered bad news to families at 2 a.m. and presented research to rooms full of skeptical physicians. I think I can manage Saturday dinner. He exhaled with relief, but before we moved on, he added something carefully. He might bring up medicine. He usually does, and he can be a bit. He searched for the word. I'll be fine, I told him. I genuinely believed that at the time. What I hadn't fully accounted for was how much Richard Calloway loved to talk, how specifically he loved to talk about cardiac surgery, and how confidently he had already decided what kind of person I was before I ever walked through his door. The drive to his parents' house took about 40 minutes, west out of Hartford into a quieter neighborhood where the houses sat back from the road behind old oaks and generous lawns. Late October, leaves turning amber and rust. James drove with both hands on the wheel, quieter than usual. You're nervous, I said. A little. Tell me about him. James glanced at me. You've heard most of it. Tell me again. He thought for a moment. He built his career during a time when cardiac surgery was still being defined. He was in the operating room for procedures that weren't standard yet. He trained under people who had essentially invented the techniques. That history means a lot to him. It should, yes, but it also means he has a very specific idea of what surgical excellence looks like, and he can be impatient with anything that doesn't match it. Does he extend that impatience to people he doesn't know? James considered that honestly. Sometimes. We turned onto a tree-lined street. The Callaway house was a white colonial with dark shutters, a flagstone path, a tidy garden put to bed for the season. Orderly, deliberate. The house of someone who believed in doing things correctly. James parked but didn't open his door immediately. You don't have to hold back tonight, he said quietly. If he says something that bothers you. I won't hold back, I said. I'll just choose my moment. He looked at me for a second, uncertain whether that was reassuring or not. Richard Calloway opened the door before we reached the front step. He was taller than I expected, mid-60s, silver at the temples, the kind of man who stood like someone who had spent decades at the head of an operating table. Even in a weekend sweater and slacks, he carried the posture of authority. James. He shook his son's hand firmly. Dad, good to see you. His eyes moved to me. They were sharp, evaluating, not unkind but not particularly warm either. You must be doctor. He caught himself. You must be the one James has been keeping to himself. That's me, I said. It's good to meet you. His handshake was brief and firm. Richard. I know, I said pleasantly. James has told me quite a bit. Behind him, a woman appeared in the doorway. Patricia Callaway was smaller than her husband, with warm eyes and the kind of composed patience that suggested she had spent many years gently managing the edges of conversations Richard started. She hugged James first, then turned to me. We're so glad you're here, she said, and she meant it. The house smelled like roasted herbs and something slow-cooked. I noticed the details in the entryway the way I always notice details. A framed photograph of a younger Richard in surgical scrubs, arms crossed, unmistakably proud, plaques on the wall, hospital affiliations, a distinguished service recognition from a medical association, books stacked on a side table, cardiology journals mixed with history. Richard noticed me looking at the photograph. Mercy General, he said simply. 1997. We had just finished a run of procedures that changed the standard of care for valve replacement in that region. That's significant work, I said. He gave a small nod that was almost approval. It was a different era. The hospital let surgeons lead. We moved into the dining room. Patricia had set the table beautifully. Candles, good china, a small centerpiece of autumn branches. James helped carry things from the kitchen while I sat across from Richard. Patricia brought wine and water. The first few minutes were easy. Patricia asked about Hartford, about the apartment I had found, about whether I had managed to explore the city yet. Richard listened more than he spoke during this part. He was still measuring. Then, almost naturally, the conversation moved toward medicine. James tells me you're in administration, Richard said, leaning back slightly, hospital side. That's right, I said. What kind of work? Operations, mostly. Department coordination, resource planning. Richard nodded slowly. Important work. Underappreciated. It can be. I agreed. He reached for his wine. The operational side of hospitals has gotten very complicated. Too many administrators without enough clinical background trying to make decisions that affect patient care. James glanced at me quickly. I kept my expression easy. That's a real tension, I said. Richard seemed encouraged. It always has been, but it's gotten worse. When I was practicing, we had administrators who understood what we needed because they had come up through clinical roles. Now you get people who understand spreadsheets and not much else. Data without context, I said. Exactly. He pointed slightly with his fork. You seem to understand that. I've spent enough time around physicians to know how that friction plays out, I said. Patricia gave me a small, pleasant smile. James was very carefully focused on his plate. Richard continued eating, but the topic had found its footing, and Richard Calloway was not the kind of man who let a good topic go. He talked about the state of cardiac surgery training, about how fellowship programs had softened, about how the cases that his generation had handled without hesitation were now committee decisions. Some of what he said was genuinely interesting. He had lived through the formative years of a field I had given my life to. There was real knowledge in him. But there was something else, too. A slow, settled assumption about who I was and what I could understand. He turned to me again partway through the meal. Have you worked closely with surgeons in your role? Yes, I said. Quite closely. Then you've probably seen it yourself. The hesitation. He paused for effect. Young surgeons today are technically trained, but they don't develop the instinct, the ability to read a situation and move. I've seen both ends of that, I said neutrally. Richard seemed pleased that I was following along. The instinct comes from volume and from being in rooms where the stakes are real. You can't teach it in simulation. You build it by operating, by making the call when everything is uncertain. James set his fork down quietly. Dad, he said, with the careful tone of someone diffusing something slowly. Richard glanced at him. What? Maybe we could talk about something else. I'm just having a conversation. Richard looked back at me. No offense intended. I imagine you see this from your side too, the way administration and surgeons can talk past each other. No offense taken, I said. Patricia tried to redirect. James, how is the Hartford project coming along? James started to answer, but Richard had found his rhythm now, and rhythm is a hard thing to interrupt. The issue, he continued, voice settling into the cadence of a lecture, is that medicine at its highest level requires a kind of confidence that institutions are increasingly trying to regulate out of their surgeons. They want consensus. They want committees. But in the operating room, consensus is a liability. I nodded once. A surgeon has to be willing to make the decision that nobody else in the room has the experience to question. He paused. That's not arrogance. That's the job. There's a version of that that's true, I said. There's only one version, Richard said with certainty. He leaned forward slightly. And I say this with all respect to people in your field, but administrators, even very capable ones, see the hospital from the outside. The people who understand what surgical leadership actually is are the ones who have stood at the table. James looked at me. I could see the apology in his eyes before he said anything. Patricia touched the rim of her glass. Richard picked up his fork again, satisfied. And I understood something clearly in that moment. Richard Calloway was not trying to be unkind. He was defending a world that had organized his entire sense of himself. He was speaking to someone he believed was capable and well-meaning, but fundamentally outside the thing he loved most. He had already built the picture. Administrator, civilian, in his way. Someone to be generously educated. He had no idea. The table had gone quiet in that particular way where everyone is aware of a current running just below the surface of the meal. Patricia took a careful sip of water. James moved his napkin from his lap to the table and back. Richard was satisfied with the silence, the way people are when they believe they've said something true. I set my wine glass down gently. "You're right that presence at the table is everything," I said. "That's not something I've ever doubted." Richard nodded once. "Exactly. It's also something I've had to think about carefully," I continued, "since I'll be responsible for the surgical culture at Whitmore going forward." Richard looked at me. "I'm the new chief of cardiac surgery there," I said. "I started 3 weeks ago." The candle on the center of the table burned quietly. James was perfectly still. Patricia's expression shifted, not into surprise exactly, but into something soft and knowing. The look of a woman who had been waiting for a shoe to drop and was relieved it had landed gently. Richard Calloway stared at me the way a man stares when the architecture of a room has just quietly rearranged itself around him. "Chief of..." He stopped. "Cardiac surgery," I said. "Yes," he set his fork down. Slowly. The certainty that had filled his voice for the past 40 minutes had gone somewhere and not yet returned. "Whitmore Medical," he said. "That's right." Richard was quiet for a long moment. He was running something through his mind. I could see it, the careful processor of a man who had spent decades thinking in high-stakes sequences. "How old are you?" he asked. It came out before he could decide whether to ask it. 34. He absorbed that. James finally exhaled, barely audibly. Richard picked up his wine glass but didn't drink from it. He was looking at the table now rather than at me. "You did your training where?" "Fellowship at Mass General. Residency at Penn." Something crossed his face at Mass General. A flicker of recalibration. "Under who?" he asked, and now the certainty was entirely gone from his voice. What replaced it was something more careful, almost clinical. I told him. Richard set his glass down. "I know that name," he said quietly. "Most people in the field do." Another silence passed. Patricia looked at her husband with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and something close to vindication. Finally, Richard looked up at me directly. "You let me talk for the better part of an hour." "Yes. About cardiac surgery." "You had interesting things to say," I told him honestly. He gave a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's a generous interpretation." He rubbed the side of his jaw. "James." He looked at his son. "You knew." "I did. You might have mentioned." "I tried once or twice." Richard looked back at me. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" "Because I wanted to meet you," I said simply. "Not have you meet my title." That answer landed differently than anything else I had said. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, just slightly, the way people move when something has reached them somewhere past the defenses. Patricia spoke quietly. "Richard." He held up one hand, gently, not to stop her but to give himself a moment. He looked at the table again. He was not the kind of man who let his face do much, but the discomfort was visible, and underneath it, something more considered was beginning. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "You don't." "Yes," he said, "I do." He looked at me steadily. "I made assumptions about what you understood and what you didn't. Based on nothing, really. Based on a story I had already decided was true before you sat down." "It happens," I said. "Not like that," he said. "Not to someone who was kind enough to listen to it." James looked at his father with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something careful and relieved at the same time. Patricia folded her hands on the table. "Well," she said softly. I think this is the most interesting dinner we've had in years. Richard gave her a look. Patricia. I'm just noting it for the record. There was a beat of silence and then something eased. Not entirely, not immediately, but the quality of the air in the room changed. We finished dinner more quietly than we had started it. Patricia steered the conversation toward easier ground, Hartford's neighborhoods, a renovation James was designing for a client nearby, a trip she and Richard were considering in the spring. Richard participated, but he was somewhere else in his thoughts, and I respected that. Realizations take time to settle. After the table was cleared and Patricia disappeared into the kitchen, Richard stood near the window at the far end of the dining room, looking out at the darkened yard. James had followed his mother to help with dishes. I walked over and stood near him. He didn't turn right away. You know, he said to the window more than to me, I spent 35 years believing I could read a room. You can, I said. You just didn't have the right information tonight. He shook his head slowly. I had enough information to be more careful. I chose not to use it. I let him sit with that. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course, in those moments when he paused. When I was explaining the field to you, what were you thinking? I considered the question honestly. I was thinking that you clearly loved it, I said. The work, the era you came up in, the cases. I was thinking that the pride in your voice was real. He turned to look at me then, and the condescension? Also real, I said. But I don't think it was personal. Richard studied my face. Most people would have corrected me the moment it became condescending. Most people aren't trying to become part of a family, I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, unexpectedly, something in his expression shifted into something more open than anything I had seen from him all evening. My son, he said, is not an idiot. I always knew that, but tonight I understood it differently. I smiled. He's the least complicated person I've ever met. In the best way. Richard nodded slowly. He gets that from his mother. A pause. The architecture I never understood. I wanted him in medicine. He builds things that make people feel safe, I said. There are worse careers. Richard gave a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Fair. James appeared in the doorway behind us. He looked between his father and me with the careful expression of someone who has been bracing for an outcome. Everything all right out here? Fine, Richard said. Then he looked at his son. I owe you an apology too. James blinked. For what? For deciding what kind of person she was without asking. James opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he said simply, Okay, Dad. Richard turned back toward me. I'd like to start again, if that's possible. It's already started, I said. He nodded once, the precise nod of a man who makes decisions and then commits to them. Patricia appeared behind James with a plate of something she had been warming. I made the pear tart, she announced, and nobody is discussing medicine for the rest of the evening. Richard looked at her. Patricia, I mean it. He sighed. Fine. She smiled at me. Come sit down. 2 weeks later, I was in the middle of a long surgery, one of those cases where the morning starts before 6 and the afternoon is already almost gone before you look up from the table, when my assistant let me know there was a call waiting from a Richard Calloway. I scrubbed out, changed, and called him back from my office. Elaine, he said. He had moved past formality in the 2 weeks since dinner, which I had noticed and appreciated. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Just finishing a case. What can I do for you? There was a pause. I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking in good faith. All right? Whitmore, he said. They're doing excellent work on the minimally invasive side. I've read some of the outcomes data. We are, I said. I used to do some teaching, he said carefully. Informally, residents and fellows mostly around the older techniques. Open approach stuff, the kind of volume work you don't see in every program anymore. He paused. I don't know if that's something you'd ever have use for. I sat with that for a moment. Richard Calloway asking if he could contribute. Not announcing, not insisting. Asking. That's exactly the kind of experience our fellows need more exposure to, I said. I'd like to talk about it seriously. He exhaled. Good, that's good. Come by the department next week. I'll introduce you to the program director. I'd appreciate that. Before we hung up, he said one more thing. Elaine. A pause. The patience you showed at dinner. I've been thinking about it. It was just dinner, I said. No, he said. It was something else. It was the kind of thing you show when you're confident enough not to need the last word. I didn't respond immediately. I told a colleague about it yesterday, he continued. I told him I met the new chief at Whitmore and that she taught me something without saying a word. What did he say? He said she sounds like someone worth knowing. Richard paused. I told him she was going to be my daughter-in-law. I smiled. I'll see you next week, Richard. 3 weeks after that, James and I drove back to his parents' house for what Patricia had called a proper welcome dinner. Same street, same white colonial, same flagstone path. The leaves had mostly fallen now, and the yard had that open, honest look that November brings. James glanced at me as we pulled into the driveway. Second time around. Third, if you count the phone call, I said. He laughed softly and turned off the engine. For a moment we sat in the quiet of the car, the last of the afternoon light coming through the windshield. Thank you, he said. For what? For not making the first dinner a disaster. I told you I'd be fine. I know. He looked at me. I also know that fine for most people and fine for you are different things. You were more than fine. You were generous. I looked at the house. The porch light was already on. Through the front window, I could see the warm glow of the dining room. He loves the same thing I love, I said. He just forgot for a moment that it belongs to more than one generation. James squeezed my hand. Richard opened the door the way he had before, but this time there was something different in his posture. Not the stiff evaluation of the first evening, something steadier. He stepped forward onto the porch. Elaine, he said. His handshake was firm and slow, the kind that carries intention. Richard. He held the door open. James went in ahead of us. Patricia made the lamb, Richard said as I stepped inside. She's been planning it all week. It smells wonderful. He paused in the entryway. I also have a question for you if you have a minute before dinner. Of course. He gestured toward his study, a room lined with bookshelves, a desk, a framed print of a cardiac diagram on the wall. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the edge of the desk. I've been going back through some of my old case notes, he said. Procedures from the early 90s, techniques we used before the field standardized around certain approaches. He touched the folder. I don't know if any of this is worth documenting formally, but I thought if you were open to it, we might go through them together. Your perspective, my history. I think there might be something worth preserving. I looked at the folder. Decades of cases, a surgeon's private record of a field in formation. I think that's worth doing, I said. Richard nodded. Something in him settled, a final easing of a tension that had been slowly releasing since that first dinner. Good, he said. Then let's eat. We walked into the dining room. Patricia was already at the table, candles lit, the good china out again. James was pouring water. It looked, in every ordinary way, like a family dinner. As I sat down, I thought about something Richard had said on that first evening. Before he knew who I was, he had said that real authority isn't about titles. It's about respect, and respect has to be earned. He wasn't wrong. He was just discovering, for the first time in a long time, that earning it sometimes looks quieter than he expected, that it can sit across a dinner table, say very little, and still change the entire shape of a room. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, that kind of quiet is the beginning of something. There's something I've learned over 12 years of making high-stakes decisions in operating rooms. The way a person treats you before they know what you're capable of tells you everything about who they actually are. Richard didn't treat me badly that evening because he was a bad person. He treated me the way he did because he had already closed the question. He had looked at me, gathered the few details James had offered, and decided the shape of me before I ever spoke a word. That's not cruelty. It's a habit. And habits that go unchallenged long enough start to feel like wisdom. What I chose not to do that night matters as much as what I chose to do. I didn't correct him the moment he became condescending. I didn't reach for my credentials the way someone might reach for a weapon. I stayed at the table. I listened, and I let the evening unfold. Some people would call that restraint. I think of it as something simpler. I was genuinely curious about who he was, and you can't be curious and defensive at the same time. The cause was a man who had built his entire sense of authority around a world that no longer looked the way he remembered it. The effect, left unchallenged, would have been an evening that ended in embarrassment and distance. Two people on opposite sides of a table who never actually met. But something else happened instead, because the response I chose created a different effect entirely. When the truth came out quietly, without anger, without performance, it left him nowhere to retreat except inward. And that's where real change begins. I think about what Richard said to me weeks later, that the most powerful thing I did was stay calm. He framed it as patience. But I think what he was actually responding to was something closer to confidence. Not the kind that needs to announce itself, but the kind that doesn't need the room to know it's there. That kind of confidence is built slowly. It comes from doing the hard work long enough that you stop needing to prove it to anyone else. You've already proven it to yourself in rooms where the cost of being wrong was very high. The lesson I carry from that evening isn't about dinner tables or titles. It's about the relationship between character and outcome. Richard changed, not because I humiliated him, but because I gave him the space to see himself clearly. And he was honest enough and strong enough to look. That combination, honesty and the strength to act on it, is rare. It's also what makes a person worth knowing. I spent years becoming someone capable of leading a department, but the skill that mattered most that Saturday evening had nothing to do with surgery. It was the ability to remain whole inside a moment that was designed, however unintentionally, to make me feel small. Nobody can take that kind of steadiness from you. You build it yourself, one difficult room at a time. And when you finally meet it, it's already there.